waters that were assessed on Maui, or marine waters, this is just marine waters, were 112 coastal segments. They listed 4 new ones, which came into, and we're going to talk a little bit about, in a minute, about what this Category 5 impaired waters means. But basically 72 segments on Maui, 72 coastal segments are impaired. The water quality is not meeting the standard. And so now that means that there are actions required. These are some examples of new listings in the last 2006 report, and quite a few of these are in some of the near and dear areas of South Maui, like Big Beach. The N means it did not meet the goal. The A means it attained the goal, so it's non-attainment and attainment, regulatory speak. But Big Beach had total nitrogen, nitrite, nitrate, turbidity, chlorophyll A, and ammonia were all out of compliance. In a landing, the only thing that was in compliance was phosphorus, and everything else was out of compliance. McKenna Landing to Malawaka Beach, every compliance. And that was based on the last 10 years worth of data. That was before construction started at that site. So quite a few, and if you look at the report, which is, if you go to the Department of Health link on your handout sheet that was provided to you tonight, you can find the report and you can see the actual list of all the South Maui areas that have been tested and whether or not they're maintained. Unfortunately, that hasn't been mapped where I could just show you a real nice picture of what it looks like. We're working on that. So what kind of pollutant sources are causing these problems? I think to most people it is surprising to find out that we have so many impairments, and when you have an impairment, it means that there's a threat to the aquatic ecosystems. These are the kind of sources we have on Maui. Non-point, we have agricultural runoff, and then development, runoff from development, especially when you put in hard surfaces, which are called impervious surfaces. It accelerates the rate of runoff, and those impervious surfaces are also always collecting pollutants from the air. If you live in Kihei, you know it gets dusty here, and there's a lot of contaminants that settle out too. So when the stormwater runs off, it washes off everything that's settled there since the last time it rained. And so for me, this is really interesting on the leeward side because it doesn't rain a lot. So we could get, our rainfall pattern might mean that we get big flushes of non-point source pollutants on, not too often, but when it happens, it's a lot of pollutants that are built up. Septic tanks and cesspools on this island are a huge source, non-point source. Cesspools, I'll show you a picture of some in a little while, are a very primitive form of treatment, and there's no disinfection for pathogens from cesspools. And basically it's just putting the waste in a hole in the ground and it goes into the groundwater and then out to the ocean. Now, point sources under the Clean Water Act, as I told you, for the most part, are regulated under the NPDES program. And that's a very stringent program that requires water quality-based limits. It requires that you consider the ultimate receptor out in the stream or the ocean when you put a limit at the end of pipe at the treatment plant. And it's not just treatment plants, but also certain types of stormwater runoff. Construction site runoff from anything over 1 acre has to have a permit. The MECO has a permit. They actually have surface water discharges of some of their cooling waters and other utility streams. Maui Ocean Center and several small sewage treatment plants on the island have NPDES permits. The county will be required to get an NPDES permit and to comply with water quality-based conditions when the population exceeds 150,000. And the Department of Health believes we're very close to that, and that this census that they're doing right now may trigger this. The interesting part is injection wells, because they are clearly point sources. but historically, they have not been regulated under the Clean Water Act and under the NPDES program. And the main reason of that has to do with how much we can show the connection between the injectate and the actual surface water qualities where we're seeing impacts. So it's kind of a gray area in the regulatory structure, and so our wastewater here is not regulated on a water quality basis like most wastewater in the country is, because ours is injected. So this is a huge concern because the underground injection control permits that are issued for these injection wells are under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So they're very protective of drinking water, but they're not required, and some people say they don't even have the authority to protect ocean water quality or groundwater quality. So this is an area of much debate, and this is where a lot of my research is on policy. It's important too to understand that those point sources are not just sewage, and it includes industrial stormwaters, industrial waters and stormwaters, as I just discussed. And here's some pictures of some of those. Cooling tower blowdowns. All the hotels have big cooling towers, and most industrial complexes have them as well. This is stormwater runoff in Wailea, and it tested very high for nitrogen. And I was like really curious, like, did someone dump a bunch of soap or something? Like, what is the white foamy stuff? And I talked to some of the people with Wailea Resort, and it turns out that the monkey pod trees, when they drop their pods, that you get all this white foamy stuff if it happens to rain. And so they actually have a program, and this would be what we would call a best management practice, where they try to trim those trees before that happens, because you know, this is one of those obvious aesthetic things that when you see that, you're like, whoa, what's going on with the water quality here? This is stormwater runoff from a construction site. And again, you have these BMPs in place that are supposed to protect the ocean. And this is at Malawaka. This is very close to the ocean. And you can see that some of the water is actually, there's sandbags under here too. Some of the water is going over the sandbags and into there. So even when there are permits and best management practices, it takes a lot of attention to detail. And so this is why we need everyone to get educated, and we need not just people that are interested in the environment, but people who work at construction sites, and everyone to understand that everything we do potentially impacts water quality. And of course, here's a treatment plant where our sewage goes for treatment before it's disposed of. And County of Maui does operate three, well, they operate more than three, but on Maui Island they have three regional plants that are fairly large. And those do primary treatment, which is removal of solids, and it's the most basic form of treatment. And then they do secondary treatment, which is in these aerated basins, and that removes a lot of the carbonaceous material that demands oxygen, and it removes some of the nitrogen. And our plants are what would be considered advanced secondary, because we take the nitrogen part of the way through the cycle, but we don't completely take it all the way to nitrogen gas. There's still some forms of nitrogen in the effluent that's injected. And in the final treatment step, they do clarification to remove solids, and they, the waters that go for reuse are called R1 waters, and those get a very high level of disinfection with ultraviolet light, and so those are fairly highly treated wastewaters, and they also get sand filtration, so those would be considered tertiary treatment. But the water that gets injected at Lahaina is not disinfected at all, so it has a heavy pathogen load potentially in there, and definitely has a lot of bacteria. So that's a public health concern, and that's one of the concerns that citizens have raised, is concerns about skin infections from swimming in the ocean and whether or not that's connected to sewage. And so that's, again, the nature of some of the research that's currently going on. And Kihei, by the way, is one of the best wastewater treatment plants on the island.